Hey, good day, Christopher Harris with Unhyphenated America. And I have a quick question for you. How important is Juneteenth for the rest of America? You see, in a thread on my Facebook page, I had stated that I have never celebrated Juneteenth, and neither has a large majority of black folks. And someone replied, well, will you now? Because why wouldn't you celebrate the freedom of slaves? Just curious. Well, here's my answer to that person. Instead of answering on my Facebook page, I'm gonna go ahead and get this answer here now, right? And I'm glad that they asked that question, but I'm gonna answer their question with another question. And that question is, when did slaves become free? See, was it on July 13th of 1787? Because that's when the Continental Congress, the predecessor of the Congress of the United States of America, said in Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, provided always that any person escaping into the same from whom labor or service is lawfully claimed in any one of the original states, such fugitive may be lawfully reclaimed and conveyed to the person claiming his or her labor or service as aforesaid. Right? You know, it's interesting when you look at a map of where slavery existed in the United States in 1790, right? And you can see the free states, or the states that had large numbers of free blacks, because guess what? I know they didn't tell you this in your history books, but every black person in the United States of America in 1787 and in 1790 and in 1810 and even in 1860 when the Civil War started, every black person in America was not a slave. I mean, we're not sitting there acting like slavery was not a terrible institution and that it was not a stain on America, but every black person was not a slave. So, here's another question. Let's talk more about dates. See, did black people become free maybe on March 22nd of 1794? See, because that's when President George Washington signed the Slave Trade Act of 1794, which was the first of several anti-slave trade acts created in the newly formed United States of America. That's key to remember. We were the newly formed United States of America. See, I point that out because a lot of people today want to run around and talk about how slavery has existed in the United States of America for 400 years. That's not an accurate statement. It's really not an intellectually honest statement either, because if the United States has not existed for 400 years, the United States of America as a nation has not existed for 400 years. So how could slavery have existed within these United States of America for 400 years? If you're an intellectually honest person, or if you're just even curious, you'll go and do the research and you realize that that's just not even a factually true statement. But anyway, going back to the Slave Trade Act of 1794, see, that act prohibited transporting slaves from the United States to any foreign place or country, and it also made it illegal for American citizens to outfit a ship for purposes of importing slaves. Key to remember. Remember, everybody's like, George Washington owned slaves? Yes, he did. He also set his slaves free eventually, right? But maybe there's another date. Maybe that next date is January 1st of 1808. See, because that is when the act prohibiting the importation of slaves was passed. And President Thomas Jefferson, someone else who owned slaves that the left hates right now, right? In his December 2nd, 1806 annual message to Congress, 2 years earlier, right? Or a year and a half earlier or so, give or take, he spoke strongly against the slave trade when he said, I congratulate you, fellow citizens, on the approach of the period at which you may interpose your authority constitutionally. That phrase is important, constitutionally, to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights which have been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa, and which the morality, the reputation, and the best interest of our country have long been eager to prescribe. Although no law you may pass can take prohibitory effect till the first day of the year 1808, yet the intervening period is not too long to prevent, by timely notice, expeditions which cannot be completed before that day. Do you understand what he's saying? He's saying that we can go ahead and stop the importation of slaves prior to the day that it actually becomes legal. Because, basically some people might say, okay, as long as I start transporting them before that day, well, why don't we stop the transportation of slaves into this country even before that day comes forward, right? It's important to know and study history. But see, maybe here's another day. Maybe it was May of 1861. I don't know the exact date, but in May of 1861, that is when the United States, or Union Army General, but if I say Union, that's the United States. That's when the Union Army General Benjamin Butler declared at Fort Monroe, Virginia, that slaves who escaped into his lines were contraband of war. Thereby, they were forfeit to their rebel owners. See, by the way, on September 27th of 1862, General Butler organized and created the 1st Louisiana Native Guard, which was one of the very first black regiments in the United States Army. See, the regiment was made up entirely of free black men. Butler, who was initially a Democrat, and people might say, oh, maybe he was opportunistic. When I read about him, I was like, he might have been a little opportunistic. But see, later on, he became known as a radical Republican. And after the Civil War, he became a U.S. representative from his home state in Massachusetts for 12 years. And while in Congress, he introduced the Enforcement Act of 1871, which is also known as the Civil Rights Act of 1871. And sometimes it was called the Ku Klux Klan Act. It was enacted to combat attacks against the 14th Amendment, which was there to protect the voting rights of blacks. And he eventually did go on to become the 33rd governor of Massachusetts. That's who U.S. Army General Benjamin Butler was, right? Let's see, here's another date. Was it August 6th of 1861? See, that's when Abraham Lincoln, who was the very first Republican to become president of the United States, he signed into law the Confiscation Act of 1861. What did that act do? See, that act codified Benjamin Butler's actions of taking and freeing Confederate-owned slaves as contraband of war. See, this act was introduced by the 37th United States Congress, where Republicans controlled both chambers. Republicans controlled 62% of the United States Senate and 58% of the United States House of Representatives. And oh, by the way, this act was in direct opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which was passed by the 31st United States Congress, where Democrats controlled 58% of the Senate and had a plurality, a massive plurality, 49.6% of the House of Representatives. I'm sensing a trend here, right? But don't get, I have more, don't worry. See, maybe another day, maybe it was September 22nd of 1862. See, that's when President Abraham Lincoln gave a preliminary warning to the South. It was called Proclamation 93. See, it stipulated that if the Southern states did not cease their rebellion by January 1st of 1863, then he would issue a proclamation freeing all the slaves held within those rebellious states. Now, the language is very precise. You have to go back and read that. But it was not freeing slaves everywhere. It's important to know that, because I know a lot of people on the left say, oh, he didn't care about freeing everyone. No, this act specifically freed slaves within specific areas of the country. But let's jump forward. Let's go ahead. So remember, he said, hey, if this doesn't happen by January 1st, 1863, I'm going to do this. Well, guess what? We all know they continue to act a fool. And here came January 1st of 1863, because that's when President Abraham Lincoln issued and authorized the enforcement of Proclamation 95, otherwise known as the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed those slaves held in designated areas within the rebellious southern states. And he said in that act, and by virtue of the power and of the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of the states are and henceforward shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. Wait a minute. Did he say persons? See, man, I tell you, you have to go and study, because one of the things you have to realize is that the language is so important. Because if you go back and you read the Declaration of Independence, right, and it talks about persons, that all people were created equal. If you go back and read the Constitution, it made forward when it talked about the the three-fifths, right? There's a lot of black folks who are, oh, the three-fifths compromise. But here's one of the things that, first of all, it did not make us three-fifths of a human being. I mean, that's silly. And if you go back and read it in context, you would know that Frederick Douglass, who was born as a slave in 1818, knew that the Constitution was not a pro-slavery document. In fact, he referred to it as a glorious liberty document. And here's something else for you to think about. If the Constitution actually gave license to slavery, then why did the Confederate States, when they formed their Constitution, feel it was necessary to specifically list protections for the institution of slavery in their Constitution? It's something to think about, right? So it's important that Abraham Lincoln referred to my ancestors as persons, right? The Constitution referred to my ancestors as persons because it was important to make sure in the language that we identified all of my ancestors as human beings, persons. See, we were not property, we were persons. But let's keep going for some other dates, right? Maybe another date that we could choose is maybe April 8th of 1864. See, because that's when the Republican-controlled U.S. Senate passed the 13th Amendment. Okay, well, let's skip forward. Maybe it was January 31st of 1865 because that's when the Republican-controlled U.S. House of Representatives passed the 13th Amendment. But, no. Here's another date. Maybe it was April 9th of 1865 because, see, that's when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his 28,000 troops to the United States Army General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. And you know, it's funny because Grant later told his officers, the war is over, the rebels are our countrymen again. So, maybe not that day. Okay, here's the dates that's important, right? Juneteenth, right? That's what everybody talks about. So maybe it was June 19th of 1865. See, because that's the now infamous Juneteenth. That's the day when slaves in Galveston, Texas, finally heard General Order Number 3 from United States Army General Gordon Granger, which, by the way, I believe there's a monument to him in, I think it's Louisville. It's either Louisville or Lexington, Kentucky, but there's a monument to him, and the left never really wants to talk about that monument to General Granger. But anyway, see, that's when he let those slaves know that the Civil War was over, and that President Abraham Lincoln, who actually had died 6 days earlier from a bullet from an assassin, he let those slaves know that the South had surrendered and the war was over. And that President Lincoln had issued those federal orders that all previously enslaved people, persons in Texas were free. Now, remember, they're already free. Right? The Emancipation Proclamation already freed them in those states who were in rebellion. And by default, when Grant accepted the surrender of Robert E. Lee on April 9th of 1865, the war was over. The Confederate States had lost. They existed no more. So maybe that was the important date. Or here's a date. How about December 6th of 1865? Because that is the day when the 13th Amendment was ratified by the required number of states. And that amendment stated, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Which is exactly what Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 said. But see, maybe another date. Maybe it was December 18th of 1865. See, because that's when the Secretary of State of the United States, William H. Seward, who was a Republican, appointed by President Abraham Lincoln, maybe December 18th of 1865, because that's the day when he proclaimed the adoption of the 13th Amendment. Remember, the 13th Amendment had passed on December 6th of 1865, but it wasn't proclaimed until December 18th. See, you know, here's the thing. While 47 different states recognize Juneteenth as a state holiday, it hasn't become a national holiday. But seriously, considering all the facts that I just laid out to you, why should Juneteenth be the day to celebrate the freedom of my ancestors more than any of the other days that I just listed? What day are we supposed to celebrate? See, I have another question. Where do our rights come from? See, they can either come from man or from the government, or they have to come from the Creator. See, when did the United States acknowledge and codify that the rights of mankind don't come from men or from the government? When did that happen? I'll refer you to the very first organic law of our great nation, the Declaration of Independence, which stated, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." And there's a whole lot more in that declaration. And part of the reason I am a conservative like I am today, because once upon a time, 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago now, I decided to actually go back and read those foundational documents. It was intellectual curiosity alone that started me on the path of becoming a conservative, that started me on the path of really becoming unhyphenated America. See, I have no problem with people wanting to celebrate Juneteenth, because it did represent a new birth of freedom for slaves in Texas. However, all Americans have reason to celebrate the 4th of July, because that represented the freedom from slavery, from all manner of tyrants that have gripped the history of mankind. See, that day is the essence of American exceptionalism. That day is the foundation for celebrating all the freedoms which all of us enjoy here in these United States of America. If there's any other day that should be celebrated by all Americans in general, particularly those of us who are descendants of the Africans sold into slavery by our fellow Africans and brought to the future United States of America, it should be December 6th of 1865. See, that is the day that finally ended any legal protection of the vile institution, the vile institution of slavery. See, if we're going to have a second national holiday to celebrate freedom, let it be that day. Let it be December 6th of 1865. That's a freedom day in the United States. All of America was free as of that day from the vile institution of slavery. My 3 times great-grandfather was born on a plantation here in Virginia in 1813. See, that's the day that he finally became free. And I don't know the exact date of the birth of my 2 times great-grandfather, but he was actually born in 1865, and I'm going to bet that he was born prior to December 6th. So guess what? He was born free. But from what I heard, actually, that my 3 times great-grandfather was actually able to purchase freedom for himself and for his family. So he became a free man prior, but he legally became free from the institution of slavery on December 6th of 1865, that we could no longer be enslaved, that was the day that we had to acknowledge, without a shadow of a doubt, the humanity of all my ancestors. But guess what? That day freed all Americans. You have to study history, and you have to study it in its proper context. Am I against Juneteenth? No, I'm not against Juneteenth. I mean, I'll celebrate any day along with you when human beings become free from tyranny. But the 4th of July is the most important day in American history, and probably the most important day outside of outside of Jesus Christ's birth and his resurrection. In contemporary modern world history, the 4th of July is probably one of the most important days in history. But for the United States of America, December 6th of 1865 ranks right up there next to July 4th. If there's going to be a national holiday, Mr. President, Congress of the United States, do your research. Let it be December 6th of 1865. I'm Christopher Harris, Executive Director of Unhyphenated America. Have a good day.